The rain hammered down like nails on a tin roof, turning the dirt roads into rivers of mud that swallowed everything in their path. In the middle of that biblical storm, two small figures ran through the darkness. A blind boy of 9 named Thomas, and his only friend in the world, a 3-legged dog he called Keeper. Tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. Hit the like button and let's begin. Thomas had learned to navigate the world through sound and touch, but tonight the storm drowned out everything he depended on. Thunder exploded overhead. Rain pounded so hard it felt like fists against his skin. Keeper pressed against his leg, guiding him forward with urgent whines, pulling him away from something Thomas couldn't see, but the dog clearly sensed. They were running from the Mercy Hill Home for Displaced Children, a crumbling institution on the outskirts of a forgotten Pennsylvania mining town where 32 children lived in conditions that would make any decent person weep. Thomas had been there since he was 4, dropped off by a distant aunt who never returned. Left to grow up in a place where blindness made you invisible in the worst possible way. But tonight wasn't about the neglect or the hunger or the cold dormitories where mold grew in corners and children coughed through the night. Tonight was about what Thomas had overheard 3 hours earlier, when he'd been feeling his way back from the bathroom and stopped outside the director's office because he'd heard his own name spoken in a voice that made his blood turn cold. Director Brennan was on the phone with someone, and Thomas had pressed himself against the wall, listening with the heightened attention that blindness had taught him. The Thomas situation needs to be resolved tonight, Brennan had said, his words sharp and final. Yes, the blind one. 9 years old. No family inquiring about him. Perfect candidate. The buyers prefer children who won't be missed, and this one definitely won't be. Thomas had felt the floor tilt beneath him. He understood enough to know he was being sold, that somewhere in the dark machinery of the world, there were people who bought children for purposes he couldn't imagine and didn't want to. He'd made it back to the dormitory, grabbed Keeper from under his cot. The dog wasn't officially allowed, but no one stopped the blind kid from keeping a 3-legged stray, and slipped out through the basement window he'd memorized months ago during fire drills. Now they were somewhere in the hills above Mercy Hill, running through a storm that seemed designed to erase them from the world entirely. Thomas had no plan beyond distance, no destination except away. His hands were scraped from falling twice already. His clothes were soaked through. His legs burned with exhaustion. But Keeper kept pulling him forward with an urgency that suggested the dog knew something, that there was a destination after all, even if Thomas couldn't see it. The thunder cracked so loud it felt like the sky was splitting open. Thomas stumbled, his foot catching on a root, and he went down hard into the mud. For a moment he just lay there, gasping, wondering if it wouldn't be easier to just stop, to let whatever was going to happen just happen. Then Keeper was there, pressing his wet body against Thomas, whining frantically, licking his face with desperate insistence. The dog had never left him, not when he'd arrived at Mercy Hill as a starving stray with a mangled leg. Not during the 3 months Thomas had nursed him back to health with stolen food and gentle hands. Not tonight, when any sensible creature would have run for shelter alone. Thomas pushed himself up. His fingers found Keeper's collar, a strip of cloth he'd braided himself, and together they kept moving. The rain began to ease slightly, enough that Thomas could hear something new, the rush of water, fast and close. A creek, swollen by the storm into something dangerous. Keeper pulled him sharply to the right, away from the sound, and Thomas trusted him completely. The dog's instincts had kept him alive this long. They climbed higher. The ground became rockier beneath Thomas's feet, harder to navigate, but also more sheltered. The trees grew closer together here, their branches forming a canopy that blocked some of the rain. Thomas could smell pine and wet stone and something else, something that made Keeper stop abruptly and let out a low, uncertain whine. "What is it, boy?" Thomas whispered, crouching down to feel the dog's body language. Keeper was tense, but not frightened. Alert, discovering something. Thomas reached forward with his hands, feeling the ground carefully. His fingers found stone, not natural rock, but cut blocks, fitted together with mortar. A structure, man-made, out here in the middle of nowhere. He followed the wall with his hands, moving carefully, keeper pressed against his side. The stone was old, covered with moss and decades of weather, but solid. It curved, suggesting a circular structure, and then his hands found an opening, a doorway, low and narrow, but definitely a way in. Inside. Thomas asked keeper softly. The dog whined once, then pushed forward, pulling Thomas through the opening. The relief from the rain was immediate. Thomas stood in what felt like a small entrance chamber, the air cool and still, smelling of earth and stone and long abandonment. He listened carefully. No sound of other people, no signs of danger, just silence and shelter. His hands explored the walls. More cut stone, carefully fitted. This wasn't a cave. It was something built with purpose and skill. He found carved details in the stone, symbols he couldn't see but could feel beneath his fingertips. Circles within circles, straight lines intersecting at precise angles, patterns that suggested meaning even if he couldn't decipher it. Keeper moved deeper into the structure and Thomas followed, one hand on the wall, the other on the dog's collar. The floor sloped gently downward. The air grew cooler. Thomas counted his steps out of habit. 37 steps before the passage opened into a larger space. Here the acoustics changed completely. The sound of his breathing echoed differently, suggesting a chamber big enough to contain something significant. He stood still, listening, and heard only silence. But it was the silence of an empty room, not the silence of nothing. This place held something. Thomas knelt down and began exploring the floor carefully with his hands. His fingers found dust and small stones, and then something smooth and cool, metal. He traced its shape. A box, rectangular, about the size of the Bible they kept in Mercy Hills Chapel. It had a latch, but no lock. He opened it carefully. Inside, his fingers found paper, lots of it, and something else, fabric, soft and aged. He lifted out what felt like clothing, small clothing, folded carefully. Children's clothes. Beneath them were more papers and something that made his breath catch, photographs. He could feel the glossy surface, the slight curl at the edges, though he couldn't see the images they held. But there was something else in the box, at the very bottom. His fingers found a notebook, leather-bound, with a strap wrapped around it to keep it closed. He untied it carefully and opened to the first page. The paper was thick, good quality, covered with writing he couldn't read. But as his fingers moved across the page, he felt something he'd never encountered before. Raised dots, small and precise, arranged in patterns. Braille. Someone had written this notebook in Braille. Thomas's heart began to pound. He'd learned Braille at Mercy Hill from an elderly volunteer who came once a week, but he'd never had many opportunities to practice. His fingers were rusty, but he slowly began to decode the first line. To whoever finds this place, if you can read these words, you are like me. You see with your hands and hear with your soul. Thomas sat back hard against the stone wall, the notebook trembling in his hands. Keeper curled up beside him, resting his head on Thomas's leg with a soft sigh. The storm continued outside, but inside this hidden chamber, Thomas had found something impossible. Someone like him had been here before. Someone blind. Someone who had left a message knowing that maybe, someday, another person who lived in darkness might find it. He turned the page carefully and continued reading, his fingers moving slowly across the raised dots, and with each word he read, his understanding of where he was and why it existed began to change everything he thought he knew about being alone in the world. The notebook told a story that seemed impossible, but his fingers couldn't lie about what they felt embossed on the pages. My name is Samuel Whitmore. I am 12 years old, and I have been blind since birth. If you are reading this, you have found the sanctuary my father built for me, and perhaps you need it as much as I once did. Thomas's fingers moved faster now, more confident as the Braille became familiar again. My father was a mining engineer who came to Pennsylvania in 1889 to work the anthracite coal seams beneath these hills. He was also a man who believed that every child, regardless of their limitations, deserved safety and dignity. When I was born blind, the doctors told him to place me in an institution and forget I existed. He refused. Instead, he taught me to navigate the world through sound and touch, to memorize spaces, to live without sight, but with full capability. Thomas read on, barely breathing. But my father understood something the world did not. He knew that people feared what they didn't understand, and that blind children were especially vulnerable to those who saw helplessness where there was only difference. So he built this place, a sanctuary carved from the living rock of the mountain, designed to be found only by someone who navigated by touch and sound rather than sight. The entrance is deliberately hidden, marked only by symbols that make sense to searching fingers rather than searching eyes. The next passage made Thomas's throat tighten. I lived here with my father for 3 years while he worked the mines below. He taught me everything he knew: how to read Braille, how to understand mathematics and history, how to cook and clean and care for myself. He prepared me for a world that would not prepare itself for me. This chamber became my school, my fortress, and my proof that blindness was not the disability others claimed it to be. Thomas turned the page. The dates indicated these entries were written in the early 1890s, more than 30 years ago. But then came the fire of 1893. The mine collapsed during an explosion that killed 47 men, my father among them. I was 10 years old. The mining company seized all assets to pay debts, and I was declared an orphan with no living relatives. They sent me to the Baxter Home for Defective Children in Philadelphia, where I learned that the world my father had protected me from was even crueler than he had feared. The next entries were shorter, more urgent. I escaped Baxter after 6 months. The superintendent had been selling children to factory owners who wanted workers too young and desperate to complain about conditions. I made my way back here, to the only home I had ever truly known. I have been living here for 7 months now, surviving on what I can hunt and gather. But I know I cannot stay forever. Winter is coming, and I am still just a child, blind and alone. Thomas's fingers found a gap in the pages, then different handwriting, adult handwriting, translated into Braille by someone who knew Samuel's story. This entry was written by Dr. Elizabeth Garrett, October 1894. I found Samuel living in this sanctuary, malnourished but alive, having survived entirely on his own for 7 months through intelligence and sheer determination. He told me about his father's dream of a place where blind children could be safe, and I made a promise to honor that dream. Samuel now lives with my family in Philadelphia. He attends the Pennsylvania School for the Blind and will become the first blind student to graduate from the University of Pennsylvania. But we have decided to preserve this sanctuary exactly as his father built it, as a refuge for any blind child who might need it in the future. The handwriting changed again, back to Samuel's distinctive pattern. December 1920. I am now 38 years old. I have become a professor of mathematics at the university, have married, and have 2 children of my own, both sighted, both raised to understand that sight is only one way to perceive the world. I have returned to this place many times over the years, maintaining it, leaving supplies, and writing in this journal, so that anyone who finds it will understand what it was built to be. Not just a hiding place, but a statement. My father believed that blind children were not broken, only different. This sanctuary stands as proof of that belief. Thomas found more entries, dated years apart, 1925, 1931, 1936, each one from Samuel, describing how he had kept the sanctuary ready, how he had never forgotten what it meant to be a blind child in a world designed for the sighted. The final entry was dated August 1940, just 2 years ago. I am 60 years old now, and my health is failing. I do not know if I will return to this place again, but I have arranged for a trust to be established, and I have left instructions with my lawyer. If any blind child finds the sanctuary and needs help, the trust will provide for their education and support until they are old enough to choose their own path. In the metal box, you will find a letter addressed to my lawyer, Henry Morrison, in Philadelphia. Show him this letter. Tell him Samuel Whitmore sent you, and he will know what to do. Thomas set down the journal with shaking hands. Around him in the darkness, darkness that was always his world, sat a sanctuary built by a father for his blind son, maintained by that son for decades in case another child like him might need it. He thought about Director Brennan's phone call, about being sold, about the invisible children of Mercy Hill who disappeared and were never mentioned again. Keeper pressed closer against him, and Thomas wrapped his arms around the dog's neck, finally allowing himself to cry. Not from despair now, but from something far more complex. Grief for the father he'd lost when he was 4, gratitude for the father he'd never known who had built this place, and hope, fragile but real, that maybe he wasn't as powerless as everyone had always told him. He wiped his eyes and began searching the chamber more systematically. His hands found supplies that confirmed Samuel had kept his promise. Canned goods, still sealed and good. Blankets stored in airtight containers. A camping stove with fuel canisters. Bottles of clean water. Everything a child might need to survive while figuring out what to do next. But more importantly, he found the letter Samuel had mentioned. It was sealed in wax inside a waterproof tube, marked in Braille, for the lawyer Henry Morrison, Philadelphia, regarding the Samuel Whitmore Trust for Blind Children. Thomas held the tube carefully, understanding that it represented something he'd never had before, a way forward that didn't depend on the mercy of people like Director Brennan. A way to escape not just physically, but legally, permanently. The storm was easing outside. Dawn would come eventually, and when it did, Thomas would have to make a choice. He could stay hidden here, safe in Samuel's sanctuary, living on the supplies left behind. Or he could take the letter and try to reach Philadelphia, to find Henry Morrison and claim the help Samuel had promised to any blind child who needed it. It was Keeper who decided. The dog stood up, stretched, and moved toward the entrance tunnel, looking back at Thomas with expectant patience. The kind of patience that said, "You've rested. You've learned what you needed to learn. Now it's time to keep moving." Thomas smiled in the darkness. "You're right, boy. We didn't come this far just to hide." He carefully repacked the letter, the journal, and one of Samuel's sets of clothes that would fit him better than his soaked Mercy Hill uniform. He found a sturdy backpack and filled it with food and water. He rolled up one of the blankets and tied it to the pack. As he worked, his mind was already planning. Philadelphia was 100 miles away. He had no money, no transportation, and no sight. But he had something more valuable now. He had proof that blind children could survive, could thrive, could build lives of meaning and dignity. Samuel had done it, and Samuel had left a map for others to follow. Before leaving, Thomas did one more thing. He found a blank page at the back of Samuel's journal and carefully composed his own entry in Braille, pressing hard with a stylus he found among the supplies. August 1942. My name is Thomas. I am 9 years old and blind. I found this sanctuary while running from people who wanted to sell me. Samuel Whitmore's story gave me courage I didn't know I had. I am going to Philadelphia now to find Mr. Morrison and claim the help that was promised. But if I succeed, I promise to do what Samuel did, to keep this place ready for the next blind child who needs to know they are not powerless, not broken, and not alone. Thank you, Samuel. Thank you, unknown father who built this place. You saved my life before I was even born. He closed the journal, returned it to the metal box, and sealed it carefully. Then he shouldered his backpack, took hold of Keeper's collar, and began making his way back toward the entrance tunnel. The rain had stopped. He could hear birds beginning their morning songs. The air smelled clean and new, washed free of yesterday's dust and heat. Thomas and Keeper stepped out of the sanctuary into a world that was exactly the same as it had been the night before, except that Thomas himself had changed completely. He was no longer running from something. He was walking toward something. He was no longer just surviving. He was claiming the life that Samuel and his father had promised was possible for blind children who refused to accept the world's limitations. "Come on, Keeper," he said softly. "We've got 100 miles to Philadelphia, and I bet Mr. Morrison is going to be very surprised when we walk into his office." The dog woofed softly in agreement, and together they started down the mountain, a blind boy and a three-legged dog, heading toward a future that neither of them could see, but both of them believed in completely. Behind them, Samuel's sanctuary settled back into patient silence. waiting for the next child who would need to discover that blindness was not the end of possibility, but simply a different way of beginning.